One of the things I like to do in my work is move away from these disadvantaged narratives that really plague the aging story of Black Americans. Most people are very interested in the weathering and accelerated aging of Black Americans, when really there's a lot of trends that suggest that's not the only way that Black Americans are aging.
From the USC Leonard Davis School of Gerontology, this is Lessons in Lifespan Health, a podcast about the science and scientists improving how we live and age. I'm Orly Bellman, Chief Communications Officer. On today's episode, how Professor Lauren Brown is leveraging data as a tool to fight bias, injustice, and racism, and working to more accurately depict the aging experience for Black communities. Lauren Brown is an assistant professor of gerontology at the USC Leonard Davis School. Her research uses publicly available data to uncover the unique difficulties Black Americans face in maintaining physical and psychological well-being as they age. Her lab both challenges the methods used to study older Black adults and strives to increase diversity in data science research with the goal of increasing the visibility of Black and Brown people via data and storytelling. Hi, Lauren. Thanks for joining us today. I want to welcome you to our podcast and also to our school. You've just recently joined this summer, so welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
I want to start by asking you to give us a bit of a history lesson regarding the role of racism in biomedical and statistical sciences and disease prediction.
This is a great start, I think, to this interview. If you think about the history of statistics and where it starts from, the earliest statisticians were actually also eugenicists. And a lot of it stemmed from the fact that Black people at the time that the census had started were property. And it was a way to count and keep up with property until we get to a point in the early 1900s when we start recording actual race in the census, and color being one of the options that you could check. And that being a way we kept track of Black populations, unfreed Black populations in particular, but also freed as well. And that transition of having Black people in the census started what was eventually used as studies that were confirming or trying to confirm biological and genetic inferiority among Black people. So once Black people were started to be included in the census and started included in medical research, clinical research, that research was usually often to compare Black people to white people with the innate goal to say Black people had more muscle mass biologically and genetically, or smaller brain circumferences, and a way to justify slavery by suggesting that the biological and genetic inferiority was a part of how Black people became slaves and would justify their continuation as slaves. So you fast forward to today, that legacy of genetic and biological inferiority in medical and statistical analyses has now manifested in things like race norming, where we're actually saying, like, there are adjustments we use for Black patients in the clinic to justify whether they do or do not qualify for care, strictly based on race. And a lot of it is based on false statistics that eugenicists had originally been publishing in the early 1900s.
So when we were preparing for this episode, you sent me a New York Times article about how they were measuring brain health in former players, and there were different standards for Black and white players. Is that an example of what you're talking about?
Great example, yeah. So the NFL recently got sued because they had a study for their former players. Their former players would get pulled in and they would go through cognitive testing. And the baseline cognitive scores were being adjusted for Black patients so that they would actually have to perform much worse in order to qualify for care relative to the white NFL players. And they got sued and settled and paid out a bunch of money because obviously that is, you're denying care to your Black players at a different rate because of a false idea about where their cognitive baseline was. So this is currently still an issue, unfortunately, and still exists in so much of our clinical and medical history. Another example is for kidney function. So the basis of kidney disease, a lot of it was around the idea that they would measure what's called the glomerular filtration rate And the glomerular filtration rate is based on muscle mass. And there was this idea, because of early eugenic scientists, that Black people had more muscle mass on average. And so they adjusted the glomerular filtration rate to adjust for that muscle mass difference. And it would mean that Black people had to have worse kidney function in order to qualify for kidney transplants or services. So this is all still existing. And only recently have we pushed to stop a lot of this race norming in science and in medical and clinical sciences.
Wow, that's so interesting. You've touched on this, but how has what you've termed injustice through data and storytelling affected the health and well-being of Black Americans, and how much of a problem does it continue to be?
I think that's a really great question when you think about like an individual, how this may affect one individual Black person. Like, for example, if we think about George Floyd's killing in 2020, his death originally was considered, the autopsy and the medical examiners performed by the county, even though it was a police-involved death, they originally blamed his underlying health conditions and drug use as the cause of death. It was only after the family got an independent autopsy that they were able to show that the death was a homicide, that then implicated Derek Chauvin, the Minneapolis Police Department, as responsible for the death and the knee on the neck. So this idea of like blaming Black biology is something that persists, I think, in larger society, and that the biological inferiority is the cause and the precipice for Black death, and that it's not at all the function of society. When actually now we know, based on a lot of great research, that the social environment is much more responsible for the fact that Black and brown people often live shorter lives than white people or any other race and ethnic group in the US. We often live with more disease and disability at the end of life. And a lot of that we know is now it's social conditions, it's discrimination, it's racism. Those are at the forefront. But the research doesn't always follow that space because of the history and the legacy that still exists, that we're still combating. And this new level of science is trying to push up against this idea.
Why is it important to increase diversity in population studies? And what are the ethical issues that must be considered when we do that?
Population studies are really important studies for understanding the larger landscape of Black life and Black health. And they are intentionally aiming to sample Black people at a rate that's higher than your average, like Census Bureau. They're intentionally trying to get the lived experiences of Black people. And so they're important spaces to focus on the data around what's happening with Black aging. However, it's been really obvious that a lot of the measurement and the things that people use to measure the well-being of Black life is really centered in white populations. And it's not innate or particular to the lived experiences of Black and brown people. And so I think oftentimes we miss the real story that's happening up underneath a lot of Black health and aging, specifically because those studies weren't designed just for Black people. They were designed for all aging populations and to monitor the aging of populations over time. And what's important is also that this data is publicly available. And so it's accessible to researchers, to anyone with interest and the data science skills to be able to use the data, and it's following people's aging over time. So being able to follow people's aging, you'll have something to say about the process of which that aging unfolds, and how that looks for Black people is often a lot different. And we need to be able to measure that. So these studies give us an opportunity to do that. So having diversity in those studies is really important for predicting aging, understanding aging populations, and being able to serve people as they're aging in those communities. So the ethical considerations, if you're leaving a whole group of people out, if you're not intentional about measuring their aging, is that you're not able to predict their clinical progression or able to assist their aging process in a way that's meaningful for them. We're doing everything much better for white populations than we are for minoritized populations. And so that the injustice is embedded in the structure of how these studies often come about. And, the intention around what I want to do in this work is to help magnify the voices of Black people in these studies so that they more accurately represent the aging experience, so that we can get better at predicting disease, preventing disease, and ensuring a better aging process.
Can you talk about what your linked Fate Data Collective is, and how are you using it to promote data equity?
Great question. Linked Fate Data Collective is a group of activists, of scholars, of students, of people who are interested in expanding their data science tools in order to promote the accurate depiction of the living process or the lived experiences of Black and Brown people. The idea being that, most of the data science spaces are very white and male, and often then reflect the values of people who are white and male. And I am very passionate about creating a space that looks and feels different for the people that I would love to bring into the data science realm. And, how we do that, I think, there's a lot of argument about the pipeline issues of how we get people into data science, or how we get people the skills to be able to do this, and how we get Black and Brown people interested in data work. But I think a lot of it also just starts from having more people there so that we can create environments that are like this. So Linked Fate Data Collective started out of that. And the inception of the name Linked Fate comes from, it's a term that was originally used in African American studies. And the term was referring to block voting in Black populations, where African Americans vote primarily Democratic, with this idea that, their fate is connected to the fate of the larger group. And so there's a interest in finding a collective voice in order to impact change and power. And that's really what I named this space about, is that we have a collective voice in data, and it's the power of an individual magnified by many that gets people something that's powerful with the data work. And so that's really what this Linked Fate Data Collective is trying to do, is bring underrepresented groups and people and their ideas into a space that will honor the data science that we want to see in the world. And that is not perpetuating scientific racism. That's not perpetuating a lot of the genetic determinism and the things that some of the current science and medical and clinical spaces are perpetuating.
And one of the studies that you mentioned there is about studying stress, ethics, and epigenetic aging among older Black adults. Maybe you can start with a little bit of a primer on what epigenetic aging is, and then talk a little bit about what this research project is.
Yeah, I'd love to. So I think it's important to start and say that, all of this work in epigenetics and genetics is happening in longitudinal studies of aging. And in these studies of aging, we have often really interesting patterns among the Black older adults. You have Black older adults who die early, often of heart disease and cancer, and they die earlier and live shorter lives. And then you have this other set of Black people who live much longer. And there's what's called the crossover phenomenon, where Black and white people flip at 80, where Black people are actually looking healthier, wealthier, more educated, and living longer after 80. So this could be a total data artifact, and just that, like a selection bias, Black people are getting pulled out of the sample early because they're dying earlier. It could also be that Black people who are ending up in the sample and staying in the sample longer are truly healthier, wealthier, wiser, less stressed, or they're living long despite the fact that they have these larger stress burdens, and they're finding ways to cope and live regardless. The impetus is to understand the stress and aging process of both of these two types of groups that we're seeing among Black older adults. And the epigenetic piece is a really powerful tool to begin to start thinking about this, because epigenetics, as opposed to genetics, is something that's modifiable after the DNA is already set. So stress can modify your genetic expression, and epigenetics measures that modification of your genes due to the social environment. So ideally, we can capture the stress experiences of Black people and how that modifies genetic expression, which could lead to differences in health and well-being. And, there's some people who even think that the stress pathways could go back generationally, that it's not this generation that's impacted by the stress burden. It's also the stress of your grandma, your mother, the generations behind you. So there's a lot of potential here to think about, the legacy of the history of the Black American experience, how that gets embedded in biology and how that manifests into some of the trends we're seeing in health and wellness at the end of life.
And maybe this is what you were talking about, is this the Black mental health paradox? Is that what you're kind of referring to when you say that some people with higher stress are living longer?
So the mental health paradox is actually totally separate from that. And it's a phenomenon that's been around for a long time, but it's the same concept. So one of the things I like to do in my work is move away from these disadvantaged narratives that really plague the aging story of Black Americans. Most people are very interested in the weathering and accelerated aging of Black Americans, when really there's a lot of trends that suggest that's not the only way that Black Americans are aging, that it's not just weathering stress, aging faster, that there are also a lot of other processes that don't act so linearly. One of them is that mental health paradox, which is this data artifact that has been found in like 5 nationally representative samples now, that despite having higher stress burdens, despite facing discrimination, despite having lower socioeconomic status, so lower education, income, and wealth, and despite having worse physical health, Black Americans have lower rates of depression relative to white Americans. So this could exist for many of reasons. It could really be a data artifact, and it just could be that we are not measuring either mental health and depression in Black people in the way that it manifests so that we can measure it. Or it may be that we're not measuring the stress that's most impactful for Black Americans. And so we're not really capturing the stress burden. And so we don't understand how that translates to mental health. And a lot of the work that I'm doing on the paradox is in that exact realm, which is that the stress experience is not being fully captured for Black Americans. And it's not acknowledging the coping response that Black Americans can use in order to fight the adversity that they're facing. So my idea here is to restore agency to Black people, that you're not just the sum of your stress exposures. You're also able to react and respond to those. And we have a lot of agency in responding to that, and a lot of historical agency and a lot of lessons generationally passed down. And that's a really important way to acknowledge both the incredible hardship that Black Americans face in this country and growing old, both psychologically and physically. But it's also acknowledging our ability to fight that at the same time. And it's already happening. You know, it's not like we need an intervention for it or something else to do for it. Black people are already doing this, and you can measure that. So yeah, it's a cool project.
And is there any other work or collaborations you're involved in that you can tell us about?
Yes, I would love to share one project that I'm really proud of. So motivated by the George Floyd murder in 2020, me and a colleague, Dr. Terrence Keel at UCLA, recently got a Russell Sage Foundation grant. We're basically going to this data source called Fatal Encounters. It is a data source that crowdsources all of the police-involved deaths that have happened in the United States. So we are going to this data source, and we are looking in LA County, and we are finding the names of people who've been involved in police-related deaths that have not involved firearms. That's because firearm deaths are very straightforward. You can typically label the death as a homicide because you know the act. But for non-firearm deaths, like George Floyd, those are more arbitrary and harder to prove homicide. And the autopsy reports can be very misleading, especially by the medical examiner and the coroners. And those autopsies are public in LA County. We're taking the names, going to get all of the autopsies from the medical examiner, coroners. So we have like 320 autopsies from 2000 to 2020. And we're trying to create a data set that represents how people are being classified in terms of cause of death. And if there's any other indication of, markings on the body, some type of conflict that happened during the process. So it's any interaction with the police out on the street or in LA County Jail. So we have both of those data sources. And we're able to try to say something about what's happening to a lot of these people, especially Black men whose moms are very interested in understanding what happened to their kid. And so the project is really motivated from that space. So yeah, I'm really proud of it.
What stage is the project in? You guys have started collecting the reports?
We have all the autopsies. We are trying to figure out the best way to ascertain the information from the autopsy. We started with teaching students how to read the autopsies, pull out the data, and then have students compare what they're pulling so that we could understand. But that was taking so long, and we only have 2 years of funding. It would have taken us probably 10 years to do it that way. Then the second phase was to use like a team of researchers who were faster, pulling out information and didn't need to double check as much. And that also took a bunch of time. I think we're going to be able to get a decent set of data out of that. But now what we're doing is exploring using AI to feed it to ChatGPT, which can be ethically fraught as well, because now we don't own, the data is not ours to own anyway. It's publicly available data, but it's feeding it to ChatGPT, which could have a whole bunch of ethical issues because the data are now owned by the people who own ChatGPT. Now that data is technically private, although brokers could, they could broker and sell it if they wanted to. But ideally, no one would be able to go back and pull a whole autopsy and, find all that information. Even though they're public information, the families might not like the ability for people to go find the autopsies online. So we need to figure out the best way to do it. But one way we're thinking about is that the AI would be able to go through the autopsy, pull out the information we want, create the data set, so that we could do it in many cities, because we have a couple of other people who want us to come expand this project to Chicago and to Baltimore, where there are quite a few police-involved deaths as well. So we'll see if that ends up happening. But I think the method of how we end up moving is still in question, and what's going to be the best way to get this data out and protect patient information at the same time.
So if I understand correctly, let's say with George Floyd, there had not been a video. Mm-hmm. That autopsy, if it had just been left as it was, would have said heart disease and what other, I think you mentioned one other.
Drug use.
Okay.
That's what they said, yeah.
And so the feeling is that many of these autopsies, there's another story.
Many of them say caused by natural death, like it's natural causes. And it's officially said natural causes. And these are young men, It was a mother. There's an organization called Dignity and Power Now. And this mother, Helen Jones, is championing a push to understand what happened to her son in LA County Jail, because he never came out alive. And he told his mom before all of that, like, Mom, I would never commit suicide. I would never do anything like that. And he died in LA County Jail. His mom wants answers. And getting the autopsy was a struggle for her. So she linked up with an organization that then Dr. Keel got connected to. So a lot of this is coming out of activist spaces where you have moms who are very intent on finding answers, but have a lot of trouble of holding the county responsible. So this is some way to try to get at the fact that this is a larger problem that's happening countrywide or countywide. But not all counties or cities have public autopsies. LA County is one that does, that we're able to do this. So it's a unique situation that we're able to take advantage of the laws here and look at people's autopsies and see if we can come up with something else.
Wow, that's really interesting. I hope you'll keep us posted on what your findings are. Yeah. And as you're talking about all your work, your research really spans the fields of history, bioethics, you're talking about demography, data science. How would you sort of define what you do, and why is it important to bridge so many disciplines? Do you think scientists miss things, or things get missed when we don't consider this whole gamut of what's involved in study design and data collection?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the stakes are really high to not consider history and ethics when you're involving the non-majority populations in research. Research and science has had really negative legacies in Black and Brown communities. And if you want to, take it further and think about just the damage that, some of the genetic studies have had in Black and Brown communities, especially with Indigenous populations, we know that they have had a ton of ethical mishaps in handling the data appropriately. And there's a natural power imbalance in data collection and research. It just exists from the very beginning. And many researchers refuse to acknowledge that power imbalance or understand how they play into it. And this is part of the business. We're not just scientists. We exist in a society that has already by nature a ton of inequity. And if you're coming to the table with all this inequity, but you don't consider that inequity in your research, you're telling a story that potentially is totally untrue for certain communities rather than others. And that's most likely going to be your Black and brown communities or your most vulnerable communities. So for me, it's realizing that research and science is situated in society more broadly, and acknowledging that full history is a part of not repeating the history. And bringing ethics into the work that I do feels so natural because of how horrific the data science has been in the past. And there's no way I would come into a legacy of that without understanding it and trying to change it. Otherwise, you're just going to repeat what they've already done. So.
And do you feel that you were seeing change as you're working, or do you feel like this is kind of something new and you're a pioneer in it, or are you seeing a difference in the way studies are being done today?
It's different in different disciplines. In genetic sciences, I think 80% of our genetic and genomic data is from European ancestry populations, even though only 16% of the world is European ancestry. So there's this huge imbalance in what we know about genetics because we only know what's happening among European populations. They're even telling people right now to not do genetic work in Black and brown populations because we're not sure what we're finding is accurate because we don't have good training data. And the way genetic sciences work is that your training data, everything is based on a reference population and a training population. It's not dissimilar from early eugenics where everything is compared to whites. You're constantly comparing Black and brown people to white people. And if that's the way you're starting, it's going to be a story that's rooted in inferiority and rooted in comparison and not necessarily rooted in the true story that should be unfolding, that you can unfold when you're not trying to make those comparisons. So that's happening really horribly in the genetic sciences where you have dominant European frameworks and genetic data. You're trying to say something about other types of people, and it's really not working. And the scientists know that, but they're continuing to just do work on European populations.
So is there an example where you can see it's not working?
Yes. So there's this really interesting seminal paper by Alice Popejoy, and she was able to show that this genetic work is leading to misclassification and misdiagnoses in Black populations. Black people are like 5 times more likely to be wrongly told they have a genetic variant that will impact their clinical outcomes that doesn't actually happen. So it's a lot of misinformation. And, when you're thinking about just using something like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and they're trying to give you some type of health information about your likelihood of getting diabetes, all of that at this point is very inaccurate for Black and brown populations. And we're still giving out that data and hoping that people use it and, take something from it. But really, those companies are trying to sell diabetes prevention, heart disease prevention, and a lot of other things that they can now use to say you're at risk. And are you going to do something about it? Now we can sell you something, right? So there's also a consumer consequence of a lot of this because geroscience, I think, is incredibly vulnerable to abuse where older adults are going to be prone to spend money on things that may or may not actually contribute to their longevity. So there's a lot at stake, I think, right now to making sure we have good data, genetic data, and that we're not leaving Black and brown populations behind as this genetic data starts to kick off and we get into more and more prediction about disease.
So here at the school, I know you're on a few committees that are involved in increasing and highlighting diversity. Why is that important and what are you working on?
I'm a co-chair of the DEI committee, and then I'm also helping out with this program called GemSTEM that is trying to improve the pipeline of scientists starting in the high school level, where we're exposing Black and brown students to science much earlier and then trying to recruit them into these fields earlier. Because oftentimes, by the time people are hiring for data science jobs or hiring for scientist jobs, the disparity between Black and white or Black and other are so far dispersed that we're not getting a good population or not any population of Black and brown scientists. So the recruitment has to start much earlier in that process and the development and training as well. So this is an initiative to aim to get more Black and brown students into.
This has been really, really a fascinating conversation, and thank you very much for joining us. It was really a pleasure to have you on this program.
Thank you so much for having me.
That wraps up this lesson in lifespan health. Thanks to Professor Lauren Brown for her time and expertise, and to all of you for choosing to listen. Join us next time for another lesson in lifespan health, and please subscribe to our podcast at lifespanhealth.usc.edu. Lessons in Lifespan Health is supported by the Ney Center for Healthspan Science.